basically just Weber's critique of his predecessors, so the liberals on one hand, but also Marx on the other hand. And a focal work of his in which this kind of critique is condensed is the Protestant Ethic, which some of you may already know very well. So I will briefly mention a little bit of background, rehearse the main points of the Protestant ethics, but then also go beyond it a little bit to see how empirically adequate it actually is, also in current day research, and also to expand it a little bit into the project of the sociology of religion, of which it was just meant to be one part. So the Protestant ethic parts from what Weber calls this elective affinity between Protestantism and capitalism. And in the second version of the Protestant ethic, the one that he redacted at the end of his life, he sees this as only one instance of a general tendency towards rationalization. Rationalization, meaning the more and more, let's say, managed and let's say bureaucratically also organized way of modern life, as you find it in bureaucracies, another important rationalizing phenomenon for Weber, but also in such phenomena as the modern polyphonic music, where this is like a very rational way where many musicians at the same time have a very specific division of labor in order to perform a modern symphony, for instance. So elective affinity is a term that Weber most probably borrowed from the novel by Goethe, the famous classical poet in German literature, who wrote a novel of the same title. In German, it's the Wahlverwandtschaft, in which Goethe himself refers to the chemics of his time, which describe elective affinity basically as a relationship between two chemical elements, which depends very much on how other elements in the surrounding are behaving. So if the surrounding elements change, then the affinity of the two elements may also change. In the novel, this is basically about four people being in very intricate kind of love relationships that change over the course also of the piece. And Weber probably adopts this term here to already hint at the fact that he does not read the relationship between Protestantism and capitalism as a very, let's say, unidirectional causal one, and certainly not a monocausal one, but one that has certain background conditions, which I will mention also in a second. So the simple observation of a correlation between Protestantism and capitalist development was nothing new at the time when Weber started to write his essay, and it is an essay, right? It is not like a very deep piece of research at the beginning of the 19th century. So here are just some of the precursors, like Gottstein, Sombart I mentioned already, who had even a little sort of a fight with Weber about who was first. Eventually, Sombart settled on being the first to have shown that Judaism was also important in the development of modern capitalism. Troeltsch came so close to claiming the same thing about Protestantism and capitalism that what is called nowadays the Protestant thesis has also been called the Troeltsch-Weber thesis, in fact, at the time. But I mean, this correlation was not simply known among academics, but it was also anecdotically known because people observed that the richest entrepreneurs of the time, the richest region in the German Empire, were rather linked to Protestantism, even though they didn't make more causal, let's say, statements about this. Okay, when we focus now on the text of the Protestant Ethic, then that was published in 2 parts in 1905, with 1906 an additional part. Then it was reworked towards the end of the life, 1920 then, with this new general preface in which Weber mainly generalizes the work towards, let's say, a more general work on rationalization. So yeah, it is important to keep in mind this distinction between this early and the late version. Weber had also traveled to the United States, actually after writing the first part. He traveled to the World Exhibition in St. Louis, but also had relatives in the United States and visited them, had also discussions with Webb Du Bois, for instance, with whom he had a lifelong also correspondence, which I will talk about also in the Du Bois lecture. Yeah, in a way, he also observed some of the religious phenomena that he also mentions in his works, but the travel to the US was not the original idea behind writing the Protestant Ethics. For a similar question, that is economic history and the question of the rise of capitalism, the lectures he gave in 1919-20 are also interesting background. Yeah. I quote here Heinz Steinert with very, let's say, detailed history of how this book came about, and Steinert is also one of the strongest current critiques of Weber. Okay, so let's get a little bit into the Protestant ethic. The starting point is, as I said, this correlation one observes between Protestantism and economic development, the rise of capitalism. Weber wrote at a time when, actually the correlation coefficient was still in the making. It was very close. Karl Pearson wrote around the very same time, but it was not the standard repertoire, so you don't see any kind of correlation charts in Weber's writings. Obviously, you do see actually some cross tables that he cites about the attendance of different schools by different religions. So I took this graph here from an interesting article, Was Weber Wrong? From 2009, where economists here just plotted, that is again the GDP figure from Madison expressed in 1990s dollar, here from the year 1900, and just the share of Protestants in the respective countries. And you see here there is at least a slight positive correlation. The more Protestant the country, the higher also the GDP per capita by 1900, with the Scandinavians here being somewhat behind, and there are also, let's say, early industrial regions here in Europe, like Belgium, where this also does not necessarily hold very well. It holds a little bit better when you decompose the historical Prussia that Weber actually lived in, and that that Becker and Wörsmann here got very interesting data on, because the Prussian statistics were very good at the time. So you see here the more than, I think, 400 it is Prussian districts in the late 19th century, with a depiction here of the districts by share of Protestants, and here to the lower right with the teacher income at the time, which is the proxy these two economists use to measure economic development. And when you look at Prussia, which is an interesting case to study, because as you see, after the Congress of Vienna, Prussia received also the Rhineland region here, which was very Catholic, and became basically a confessionally mixed kind of state. So when you look at Prussia, you see at least a slight visual correlation between economic development and the dominant religion, which is not perfect, obviously. So you have the Catholic Rhineland here, with also the industrial heartland of Western Germany. So a coal and steel region with quite high wages, apparently. You also have the quite Protestant here East Prussian territories, which were very poor, but you also have a clear overlap here of the Protestant heartland with a very more higher GDP proxy. So yeah, this is just basically modern data that were not available to Weber, which confirm a little bit this basic correlation, and which lives on, you could say, even up to the current day. If you leave then Eastern Germany aside here, which due to its socialist history is obviously a very different case. When you look at the religious stratification here of Germany after the Westphalian peace treaty in the 17th century, and current day Western Germany at least, then there is an astonishing continuity in the dominant confessional orientation of the different regions. So this could also, inspire any kind of sociology of religion to look a little bit more at the many consequences, social consequences that this religious divide has on many and not just economic features of our societies. So let's focus a little bit more now on the Protestant thesis. So what I showed you just was basically to motivate here this correlation between Protestant doctrines being present in a certain region and the development of capitalism. And so Weber motivates he let's say fine-grains also his explanans and explanandum by saying that it's about, his explanation is about the development of rational capitalism. That is, he does not want to explain the previous kind of capitalisms, for instance, adventure capitalism, right? This is when the East India Company, for instance, acted as a kind of state pirating enterprise to make profits. Or he also does not talk only about merchant capitalism of previous times, but the rational organization of manufacturing capitalism. This is the explanandum for Weber. And Protestant doctrines are compared then to other religions, but also to, let's say, more traditionalist ways of organizing work. Yeah. So in presenting the main argument of the Protestant ethic here, I would like to draw on an author whom we will encounter in one of the future lectures, and that is James Coleman. Coleman is a rational choice theorist who tries to reconstruct Weber's argument in, let's say, what is called here Coleman's boat. Yeah, because it looks a little bit like a boat. And by making the point that Weber was at least on the way towards also a micro foundation of a macro argument. So the correlation that we have covered so far is the macro level. Up here is the macro level, where you have non-individual kind of tendencies, entities, and so on, right? Protestant doctrines and regions, the emergence of capitalism, and so on. And Coleman presents this because he has this methodological idea that any kind of correlation between these macro elements for it to be causal needs a micro foundation. So it needs here on the micro level, so this is the individual level of analysis,